The wagon stopped in front of the white church at Hollis Creek, with a sound like a bone settling, and Augusta Whitmore put one hand on the wooden seat and stepped down in her best blue dress. The dress had taken her 3 weeks to sew and a week to take out and a week to take in again, and it fit her the way her own skin fit her, which was to say it covered what was hers and asked no one's apology for the size of it. Towel. 260 pounds came down off that wagon in a single careful motion, and the Rourke side of the churchyard went quiet, and the Brand side of the churchyard went quiet, and a hand near the back of the Rourke line said, not quite under his breath, "Lord, he married a barn." She heard it. Both families heard it. The Reverend on the church step heard it, and the wind through the cottonwoods heard it. And Caleb Rourke, standing at the church door in a coat he had not worn since his wife's funeral 4 years ago, heard it too. Caleb did not turn his head. Augusta did not turn her head either. She did not flinch. She did not blush. She did not look at the speaker. She set her hand carefully on the smoothest part of the wagon rail, the way her father had taught her to settle a nervous horse without showing the horse you knew it was nervous, and she walked across the packed dirt of the churchyard toward the man she had agreed in a letter to marry. The hem of her dress did not catch. Her chin did not drop. The Brand women on the left side watched her with eyes like flint, and the Rourke men on the right side watched her with the embarrassed half-grins of men who were not sure whether to laugh again or look away, and Augusta walked past all of them as though the only person in the churchyard were the Reverend, and the only thing required of her in this life were to put one foot in front of the other. When she reached the step, Caleb Rourke looked at her once, plainly, full in the face, with eyes the color of creek water in autumn. He did not flinch. He did not look her up and down the way men did. He looked at her the way you look at a person you have agreed to stand beside, and he stepped aside so she could go in first, and something inside her cracked open. If this story already has your chest a little tight, do me a small kindness and hit that subscribe button so you can follow Augusta's story all the way to the end. Stay with me to the very last word. I promise you the women on this porch are not done yet. While you're there, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight, because I want to see how far Augusta's story travels. It was the 3rd week of April in 1885, and the country around Hollis Creek had not yet decided whether it wanted to be green. The cottonwoods along the creek were budding hard and stubborn, and the wild grass on the long flats between the Rourke Ranch and the Brand Ranch was coming up in patches the color of weak tea. The creek itself was running thin for the season, which the older men noticed, and the younger men did not, and the cattle on both sides of it had begun to drift toward the same exhausted strip of bank where the water still came up clear over the stones. None of this was on Augusta's mind as she stood inside the small church and said the words the Reverend asked her to say. What was on her mind was the floor under her boots, which was uneven, and the smell of new pine sap from a pew that had been replaced after a winter storm, and the way Caleb Rourke's hand when he took hers to slide on a thin gold band was as cold as a horseshoe in February. She said yes. He said yes. The Reverend said the words and closed the book, and there was no kiss because no one had asked for one and no one expected one, and Augusta Whitmore became Augusta Rourke in the time it took a man to draw 3 breaths. Outside the church, the two families were still arranged, on their opposing sides of the dirt yard, like 2 herds at a salt lick, watching to see who would move first. Eleanor Brand, the Brand matriarch, stood at the front of her people in black bombazine, with a spine like a fence post. Caleb's grandfather, Silas Rourke, stood at the front of his people on 2 canes, his white hair lifting in the wind, his jaw set. The 2 of them did not look at each other. They did not have to. 10 years of buried sons and shot dogs and burned haystacks lay between them like a 3rd creek, and the wedding had been their attempt to bridge it without saying the word peace out loud. Caleb walked Augusta back to the wagon. He handed her up without comment. He climbed onto the seat beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue at the team, and the wagon rolled out of the churchyard with the two families still standing on their two sides watching it go. Augusta did not look back. She had taught herself a long time ago not to look back at rooms she had been asked to leave. For the first mile, Caleb said nothing. Augusta let him have the silence. She knew the shape of certain silences, and this one was not a hostile silence, so much as a tired one. She watched the country open out, the long roll of pasture broken by limestone outcrops, the dark thread of the creek to the south, the low blue ridge to the west, where the sun would set in another 4 hours. And she counted because counting was a habit her father had taught her on contested ground. She counted fence posts. She counted cattle on the Brand side of the creek. She counted cattle on the Rourke side. Both counts were lower than they should have been for the size of the land. She filed that away. My grandfather and Eleanor Brand brokered this, Caleb said at last. He did not look at her. He looked between the ears of the off-horse. You should know that plain. It wasn't my idea. It wasn't hers either, but she signed it. The two of them sat down at a table in town, with the Reverend and the assessor and the bank, and they wrote out a peace bond, and the bond was that O'Rourke would marry a woman with no kin on either side, and she would carry the Rourke name and stand between the families until the shooting stopped. I read the notice in Kansas City, Augusta said. I answered it in my own hand. You knew what it was. I knew what it said it was. He glanced at her sidelong, then, a flicker, and went back to the road. I don't expect anything from you, he said. I want you to understand that you'll have a roof. You'll have your own room. There's a kitchen and a larder and a piece of garden if you want it. There's a child in the house, my brother's girl, name of Wren. She's 7. She doesn't talk. You don't need to do anything about that. She's like that with everyone. I expect a name on a paper, that's all. The rest of it, what people will say, what they'll do, I can't promise you. All right, Augusta said. I mean it. I'm not asking you to be anything. All right, she said again, and looked out at the country and let him hear that the word was not a small word when she said it. He was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, he shouldn't have said what he said. In the churchyard. He won't say it twice. He'll say it again, Augusta said evenly. Just not in front of you. Caleb looked at her then, for longer than a flicker. He did not argue. He turned his face back to the road. That was the thing about Caleb Rourke. She would learn. He did not pretend that the world was kinder than it was. He simply did not flinch at it. The Rourke house sat on a low rise above a bend in the creek, a long, low ranch building of weathered cottonwood and stone, with a porch running the length of the south side and a kitchen wing thrown off the back like a thought added late. There was a barn beyond, and 3 corrals, and a smokehouse, and a sagging chicken yard, and beyond all of that, the long sweep of pasture rolling away to the southwest, where the Rourke cattle grazed in scattered clumps the color of dried mud. As the wagon came up the lane, Augusta saw at once the thing she always saw first when she came to a piece of land. That the south fence had a sag in it about a 1/4 mile down where a corner post had rotted. That the chicken yard had been built too close to the kitchen, so the smell would carry on a hot day. Weeds standing up like soldiers in straight rows where vegetables ought to be, and that the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney was thin and wrong, the smoke of a banked fire. Someone had forgotten to feed. No one came out to meet them. A boy was leading a horse across the yard and stopped to watch them, with his mouth a little open. A man on the porch did not stand up. Caleb pulled the team up at the rail and got down and tied them off without a word to anyone. And then he came around and offered Augusta his hand. She took it. He did not flinch at her weight as she came down off the high step, only set his feet and let her use his hand for what hands are for. He let go as soon as she was steady, which was a courtesy of its own. "The kitchen's through there," he said, pointing. "Pick whatever room you want off the back hall. I'll have your trunk brought in. There's a man named Dorsey runs my hands. He'll do as I tell him in front of you, and not always behind me. The cook quit in February. The girl will be somewhere. Probably under the table." "All right," Augusta said. He looked at her a half-second longer as if he had meant to say something else and had decided against it, and then he walked off toward the barn. Augusta went up the porch step. The man sitting there did not stand. He was lean and weathered and had a face the color of saddle leather, and his eyes followed her up the step with a careful measured insolence, the kind a man practices in front of mirrors when he does not know he is doing it. He had a coffee cup in his hand, and he did not lift it in greeting. "Ma'am," he said. "Mr. Dorsey," she said, because there was no one else it could be. His eyebrow rose a fraction. He had not given his name. She walked past him into the house. The front hall smelled of cold ash and old leather, and the faint sweet rot of an apple gone bad. Somewhere out of sight, the floors were swept, but not scrubbed. A clock on the mantel had stopped at 20 after 3. There was a coat on a peg that had been a woman's coat once, and Augusta did not look at it twice. She walked through to the kitchen at the back, and the kitchen was the coldest room in the house. The stove was out, not banked, out. There was a thin gray drift of ash in the firebox and a single split of cottonwood, lying on the floor where someone had dropped it and not picked it up. The big work table in the center had crumbs on it from at least 2 meals ago. A tin of flour sat open on the sideboard, with the lid leaning beside it. A churn stood in the corner, with the dasher still in it, and the cream inside had separated and gone sour and quiet. The window over the dry sink was streaked with old rain. A blue enamel coffee pot sat at the back of the stove, cold. Augusta took off her good blue bonnet and hung it on the nail by the door. She rolled the cuffs of her best dress up to the elbows, because the dress was the only one she had that was both clean and dry, and she would change out of it as soon as her trunk came in, but until then it would do the work that needed doing. She crossed to the stove. She knelt, and her knees protested, because she had ridden 2 days and stood up in a church and not eaten since dawn. And she opened the firebox and looked in. A small sound came from under the table. Augusta did not turn her head. She set the split of cottonwood by the stove. She rose slowly and went to the wood box by the door and counted what was in it. 4 sticks of cottonwood, 2 of oak, a handful of pine knots. Enough for tonight if she was careful. She brought an armful back to the stove. She laid a fire the way her father had laid them on a wagon trip when she was 9. Pine knot at the bottom for heat, cottonwood splits cross-hatched above, the oak tucked at the back for the long burn. She got down on her knees again and struck a match from the tin on the warming shelf, and the pine caught at once, and the small bright sound of fire filled the cold kitchen. The sound under the table got smaller, the way an animal gets smaller when it has decided to hide harder. Augusta sat back on her heels. She did not turn. She spoke at the stove. "I'm Augusta," she said. "I'm new here. I don't know where anything is. If you knew where the salt was kept, I'd be grateful. But you don't have to come out to tell me. You can just say." There was a long silence. The fire popped. The kitchen began to warm in a small, slow circle around the stove. In the blue crock, a child's voice said, "Very small, very flat." "Thank you," Augusta said, still at the stove. "And the lard, down cellar, on the second shelf." "But in the brown jar." "Thank you," Augusta said. "I'm going to make cornbread, because cornbread is the fastest thing I know how to make. And after that I'm going to make a stew, because the larder will tell me what kind. I won't ask you to eat any of it. But if you want any when it's done, there'll be plenty." There was no answer. Augusta got up off her knees with both hands on the edge of the stove and went to find the cellar door. By the time Caleb came in from the barn at dusk, the kitchen smelled of cornbread and onions, and the rich brown smell of beef bones simmered hard, and the lamps were lit, and the floor under the work table had been swept, and a small girl with hair the color of dry hay was sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around a tin cup of warm milk. She did not look up when Caleb came in. She did not flinch either. She drank her milk in small, careful sips, and Augusta moved around her without touching her, and Caleb stopped in the doorway and looked at the two of them, and did not speak for a long time. "You found the cellar," he said at last. "Wren told me where," Augusta said. He looked at the child. The child did not look up. Something moved in his face that he closed down again before it could be read. "Sit," he said to Augusta, gesturing at the table, and went to the wash basin in the corner. That was the first supper at the Rourke house. In the days that followed, Augusta did what Augusta did, which was to put one foot in front of the other in the rooms she had been given, and to make herself useful in ways that no one had asked her to be useful, and not to apologize for taking up space at the work table, or in the doorway or on the porch step. By the end of the third day, she had the larder inventoried in a small notebook in her own neat hand, 3 sacks of flour with weevils. In the second one she would have to sift 2 crocks of lard, a smoked ham hanging in the spring house with mold she could trim, a barrel of beans, half a barrel of cornmeal, sugar enough for 6 weeks if she did not bake sweets, no eggs, because the hens were not laying, because the hens were not being fed. By the end of the 5th day, the hens were laying again. By the end of the 6th day, she had walked the south pasture with a stick and come back to the kitchen and said to Dorsey, who happened to be standing on the porch, "The east end of that pasture is grazed to dirt, and the west end is full of brush. You'll want to move the herd across before the end of the week, or you'll lose the rest of the grass." Dorsey looked at her a long moment over the rim of his coffee cup. Then he said, "Mr. Rourke handles the grazing." "All right," Augusta said. "Then he'll want to move them by the end of the week." She went back inside. That night Caleb came in late, smelling of horse and cold air, and stood in the kitchen doorway. The child ate without looking up, but she ate. She had been eating, in small, steady increases, every meal since the first. "You walk the south pasture," Caleb said. "I did. Dorsey told me what you told him." Augusta set the ladle back in the pot. "He moved them this afternoon," Caleb said. "West End, like you said. Good." He did not move from the doorway. "Where did you learn pasture?" "From my father. He ran cattle outside Topeka, on a piece of land 3 other men also claimed. He said you could lose your land in court, or you could lose it under your cow's feet, and one was slower than the other, but both ended the same place." Caleb almost smiled. He did not quite, but the line of his mouth softened a fraction. "There's a lame heifer in the near corral," he said, "hind leg. I was going to put her down tomorrow. Let me look at her in the morning, before you do." He nodded once, and turned and went down the hall toward his own room, and Augusta heard his door shut quietly and not slam. The heifer was not foundered. The heifer had a stone the size of a walnut wedged up between the cleats of her right hind hoof, and a small infection from where she had tried to walk on it. Augusta got it out herself, with a pick and a pair of pliers, and the patience of a woman who had once spent a whole afternoon getting a fishhook out of a setter's lip without losing the dog. She packed the hoof with a poultice of the lard from the brown jar and a handful of pine tar from the barn, and tied it off with a strip of clean rag. And by the 2nd day the heifer was bearing weight on it, and by the 4th day the heifer was walking out to graze with the herd daw. And Caleb stood at the corral fence and watched her go, and said nothing at all. He said nothing at all about a great many things in those first weeks. He said nothing when he found Wren sitting on the kitchen step in the late afternoon shelling peas into Augusta's apron. He said nothing when the larder shelves began to fill, not because there was more food, but because what food there was had been moved and counted and set in order so that you could see at a glance what you had. He said nothing when the chicken yard fence was repaired, though Augusta had not done that herself. She had simply mentioned at supper, without looking at Dorsey, that a fox would find the gap before midsummer, and the gap had closed by the next morning. He said nothing when she set a plate at the long table for any hand who wanted to come in for the noon meal, and 3 of them came the first day, and 5 the second, and 7 the third. He stood in doorways and watched. He drank his coffee and watched. He came in from the barn at dusk and stopped in the kitchen doorway every night, the way a man stops at the edge of a creek to see if it has risen. The hands tested her. They tested her in the small, cruel ways men test a woman who has been put in a position above them by a paper they did not sign. They moved the salt cellar to the far end of the table when she sat down. They asked her, very politely, to pass dishes that required her to reach across the whole length of her own arms. They commented on the size of the cornbread squares she cut. One of them, a thick young man named Pell with a red beard, made a show of standing up to let her through the kitchen door, and then standing too close, so that she had to either brush against him or stop. She stopped. She waited. She looked at him with the patient, flat eyes of a woman who had been looked at all her life and had grown to like none of the looking. And after a long, uncomfortable moment, Pell stepped back, and she walked through. Dorsey watched all of this from the head of the long table where the hands ate. And Dorsey did not stop any of it, and Dorsey did not start any of it either, which Augusta noted. Dorsey was the kind of man who let other men do the cruel work and then declined to be blamed for it. On the 6th night, a hand named Buck, older than the others, with a slow drawl and an eye that wandered, said over his stew, "Mrs. Spite, Rourke, my mamma, used to say a big woman in a kitchen was a sign of prosperity. We sure are looking prosperous around here lately." The other hands laughed. Wren, sitting at Augusta's elbow, did not look up. "Bye." Augusta refilled Buck's coffee cup and set the pot back on the stove without a word. "Buck," Caleb said. The kitchen went quiet. Caleb had not raised his voice. He had said the name the way you say a name to a dog that has done something it knows. "It should not buck," he said again. "You'll thank Mrs. Rourke for your supper. You'll do it now. Then you'll go finish setting that south corner post. And you won't sit at this table again this week." Buck's mouth opened. Closed. He looked at Dorsey. Dorsey looked at the wall. Buck looked at his plate. After a long moment he said low, "Thank you for the supper, ma'am." "You're welcome," Augusta said. Buck stood up and took his hat off the peg by the door and went out, and the screen door slapped behind him, and the kitchen stayed quiet a long moment longer. Caleb did not look at Augusta. He went on eating. After a while the other hands went back to eating too, but more quietly, and when the meal was done they thanked her, one by one, as they went out, even Pell, who muttered it at the floor. That night, long after the lamps were down, Augusta woke to the sound of bare feet in the hall. She lay still. She knew the sound was not Wren. Wren slept curled in a small ball in the room next to hers, and did not wake at night. The child had taught herself out of waking at night the way she had taught herself out of speaking. The footsteps were heavier. They paused outside a door at the far end of the hall. A door Augusta had not yet opened because she had been told plainly, without being told that it was not to be opened. The door of the sealed kitchen at the back of the house, the small private kitchen that had been Caleb's wife's 4 years gone, and that the man on the porch the first day had told her in 3 sentences, without quite telling her, was not to be touched. Not. Augusta got up. She put a wrapper around herself. She walked barefoot down the hall in the dark, because the house had taught her where the boards creaked in only a week, and she stopped at the corner where the hall turned. Caleb stood at the sealed door, with his forehead pressed against the wood. His hand was on the knob and not turning it. He was in his shirt with no coat, and the lamp had not been lit, and the moon through the kitchen window picked out the lines of him in silver and gray. He did not move, he did not push the door. He stood there with the kind of stillness that costs a man more than motion does, and Augusta understood at once that he had stood there many nights, that he stood there as another man might drink, and that he had no idea he was no longer alone. She made the smallest sound. Not a step, not a word, only the smallest sound of her hand on the wall. She did it on purpose. She did it because to walk away without making the sound would be to spy on him, and to make the sound and let him hear that she had seen was a courtesy. He turned his head. He saw her. She did not move. She did not speak. She did not retreat. She let him see that she had seen him, and she let him see that she would not say a word about it. And after a long moment, he took his hand off the knob and walked past her back down the hall, without looking at her, and she stood at the corner until his door closed. The next morning he did not look at her over breakfast. The morning after, he did. Over the rim of his coffee cup he said plainly, in his ordinary voice. Most folks would have said something. I'm not most folks, Augusta said. He looked at her then for longer than he ever had. He looked at her the way you look at a horse you have been riding for a week, and are starting to suspect has more in it than you bought it for. Then he picked up his hat and went out to the barn. The trouble with the creek she found by accident on a Thursday in the second week of May. She had ridden out with Wren up on the saddle in front of her. Wren had asked in 3 words if she could come, and that was a thing in itself, to look at the south fence on the strip that ran along the disputed bank. The horse was an old gray mare named Penny, who did not mind the weight of 2 on her, and the day was clear and high and smelled of hot grass and water. They rode down the long slope to the creek, and Augusta pulled up at the bank and let the mare drink, and while the mare drank, Augusta sat and looked. She had been looking at the creek for a week, in pieces, from various places, along its run. She had noticed in pieces. Now she sat above it for a long, quiet hour, and let the pieces come together. The creek was running thin. That she had noticed at the wedding. It was running thinner here than it should be running for spring. And the bed of it on the Rourke side showed a high water mark from 2 seasons ago that was 1.5 feet above where the water sat now. Across the creek, on the Brand side, at the mouth of what had been a wide, shallow draw, there were stones piled in a careful, unnatural way, and the draw was choked with new alder and last year's brush. Augusta walked Penny along the bank a half-mile until she found what she was looking for. A place where the ground dipped on both sides and the grass grew greener in a long, thin line that ran away from the creek into the Rourke pasture and met, 300 yards in, a corresponding green line coming the other way out of the Brand pasture. The 2 lines did not meet at the creek. A channel had once cut across the land from the Rourke side to the Brand side, and back an irrigation ditch carrying creek water out and around to both pastures, dug a long time ago by men who had agreed on something, even if the men they raised had not. The channel had been filled in. Not collapsed, filled. The fill was newer than the country around it. You could see it in the way the grass came up over it. Weaker. And later, like hair growing back over a scar. She rode back to the creek itself, and got down and walked the bank, with Wren walking beside her holding her finger. There were survey stakes along the bank. There had always been, she supposed. But these were not always. The stakes were oak. Sadder. And the stakes had been weathered to look gray. But Augusta knew the look of weathered oak from new oak that had been smoked or stained to look weathered, because her father had taught her to know it on a piece of contested ground outside Topeka in 1869. She knelt by one and ran her thumbnail across the cut end where it had been driven into the soil. The cut was clean and bright under the surface gray. The stake had been put in this spring. Possibly this month. She walked the line of them. Each one had been driven in fresh. Each one stood about 10 yards north of where the old creek line ran, where the old high-water mark on the rocks said the creek had always run. The new stakes pulled the boundary north by 10 yards along a half-mile stretch of bank, and the half-mile stretch was the only stretch where the water still came up clear and where the cattle on both sides had been pushed to drink. Augusta sat down on her heels by one of the stakes and looked at the creek for a long time, and Wren stood beside her with her small hand on Augusta's shoulder, and the only sound was the water moving over the stones. "Aunt Augusta," Wren said. It was the first time she had used the word. "Yes, honey." "What are you looking at?" "A piece of land," Augusta said, "that somebody is trying to steal without anybody noticing." Wren considered that. "Is that why they shoot?" "They shoot because they don't know yet," Augusta said. "They think they're shooting at each other." She did not say the rest of it out loud. She thought it, though, sitting there with the child's hand on her shoulder, and the water moving over the stones, that somewhere there was a man, and the man had a name, and the man had moved the stakes and filled the channel, and the man was sitting somewhere counting on both families to bleed each other out. Before either one of them looked down at the ground, she did not tell Caleb that night. She did not yet have the shape of it, and she had learned early that you do not bring half a thing to a man who is already grieving. She wrote it down instead, in the small notebook in which she had inventoried the larder, with figures and dates and the position of each stake measured by paces from a particular cottonwood, whose root she had marked with a stripped twig. She wrote nothing about the man behind it. She did not yet know his name. She knew it 3 days later. She rode across the creek on a Sunday afternoon with a basket on her arm. The basket held a jar of pear preserves she had made from last fall's pears she had found at the back of the cellar, and a loaf of her own bread and a tied bundle of dried sage. She had told Caleb where she was going at breakfast. He had set his cup down very slowly and said, "Augusta, I know," she had said. "Eleanor Brand has not let a Rourke through her gate since 1881. I'm not a Rourke," Augusta said. "Not in the way she means." He had looked at her a long moment over the table. He had not stopped her. He had said, "Take the gray mare. She knows the ford." Penny did know the ford. She took it carefully, picking her way over the wet stones, and brought Augusta up dry on the Brand side. And Augusta rode up the long lane to the Brand house, with the basket on the saddle in front of her, and her best blue dress on under her riding coat, because she had wanted Eleanor Brand to see her in the dress she had been mocked in at the wedding. The Brand house was older than the Rourke house, and built lower to the ground, of squared logs gone gray with age, with a wide porch, and a row of geraniums and tin cans along the rail. 2 men were sitting on the porch when Augusta rode up. They stood when they saw her. They did not stand for politeness. They stood the way men stand when an unfamiliar wagon comes up a road they thought they controlled. One of them put a hand on the railing near a rifle. Leaning there, "Ma'am," he said. "Mrs. Rourke," she answered, calling on Mrs. Brand. He did not speak for a beat. Then he turned without taking his eyes quite off her, and called over his shoulder into the house, "Mother, there's a Mrs. Rourke at the porch." There was a long silence inside the house. Then a voice, old, dry, hard as wagon wheel iron, said, "Let her come in, Thomas, and take her horse." Thomas Brand did not look pleased. He took the mare's reins anyway. Augusta got down with her basket and went up the steps. The other man stepped aside without quite stepping aside, and she walked past him into the cool dim of the front room. Eleanor Brand sat in a high-backed chair by the cold fireplace in a black dress, with a small white collar. She did not stand. She had not stood, Augusta suspected, when anyone but God came into her parlor in 20 years. Her hair was iron gray, parted in the center, drawn back tight. Her hands were folded on the head of a black cane. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they did not blink as Augusta crossed the room. "Mrs. Rourke," Eleanor Brand said. "Mrs. Brand." "Sit down." Augusta sat down in the chair opposite. The chair was small. She arranged herself in it without fuss and without apology, and Eleanor Brand watched her do it with no expression at all. "You brought a basket." "I brought pear preserves and bread and dried sage. The preserves are from your side of the creek. The pears came off a tree that grew up before the line was drawn." Eleanor Brand's eyes moved a fraction. "Is that a thing you say to me on purpose?" "Yes, ma'am." "You walked through my gate with a Rourke name on you. I walked through your gate with a name I have had for 3 weeks. Before that I had my father's name. He ran cattle outside Topeka, and was killed, in 1872, by men who thought he had no business standing on the piece of ground he was standing on. I have no kin in this county on either side, and the people who arranged my marriage chose me for that reason. I would prefer that you not waste my afternoon by pretending you do not know any of this." Eleanor Brand was quiet for a long beat. Then, slowly, the corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the recognition a hard old woman gives to another woman. She has just decided is not going to bore her. "Pour the tea, Thomas," she said without looking around. And Thomas Brand, who had come in behind Augusta, and was standing in the doorway with his arms folded, looked as though he had been struck. He went, after a moment, to the sideboard. They talked, then for an hour. They talked about the spring grass, and the price of feed, and the weather. They talked about Wren. Eleanor Brand had not known the child was eating again, and something passed across her face when Augusta said so that she controlled at once. They talked about Caleb's wife briefly, because Augusta did not flinch from the name when Eleanor Brand said it. They talked about Eleanor Brand's husband, dead 7 years, and her older son, dead 4, and her younger son Thomas, standing in the doorway. They did not talk about the feud. They did not talk about the creek. They did not talk about who had shot first or last. They circled all of it without naming it, the way two people walk around a deep hole in the dark, by feel. At the end of the hour, Eleanor Brand set her teacup down with a small, precise click and said, "Mrs. Rourke, I want to know what you have come here for." Augusta had been waiting for the question. "I rode along the creek 3 days ago," she said. "On our side I saw a number of things. I saw that the irrigation channel between the two ranches has been filled in within the last year. I saw that the survey stakes along the disputed strip are new oak-driven this spring and made to look old. I saw that the creek is running 1.5 feet lower at the bend than the high water mark says it used to. I did not come here today to ask you what you know. I came here because I would like you to know that I saw." Eleanor Brand did not move for a long moment. The hand on the cane tightened, then loosened. Her eyes did not leave Augusta's face. "Thomas," she said very quietly, without turning, "go down to your father's office and bring me the tin box from the bottom drawer of the desk, the one with the green band on it." "Mother, go." Thomas Brand went. The two women sat in the parlor in silence and listened to his boots cross the hall and go down a back stair, and after a long while come back up. And a moment later he stood in the doorway, with a small, flat, tin box in his hands. He held it the way you hold a thing that has been a weight in a desk drawer all your life. "Give it to her," Eleanor Brand said. He did not move. "Thomas," Eleanor Brand said, "give it to her." He came across the room and put the tin box in Augusta's lap. It was not heavy. It was the weight of papers and nothing more. "My husband," Eleanor Brand said, "trusted one person in this county with the contents of that box. He trusted his oldest friend. His oldest friend is dead." She paused. "I am not a woman who trusts twice. I am giving this to you now because I have sat across from you for an hour, and I have decided that I am going to. Do not make me regret it. Open it only when you are in a room where you can shut the door, and read what is in it, and then come back here and tell me what you mean to do." "Yes, ma'am," Augusta said. "Don't, ma'am. Me. Eleanor, go." Augusta stood up, with the box in her hands. She did not look inside it. She did not put it in the basket. She held it under her riding coat as she walked out of the house, and Thomas Brand handed her up to the saddle without speaking. And she rode back down the long lane to the ford with the box pressed against her ribs and her heart beating slowly and steadily. The way her heart had always beat in the moments when a thing she had suspected was a thing began to be. A thing she knew. She read the papers that night in her own room, with the door shut and a chair pushed under the knob. The papers in the box were 4. The first and oldest was a Land and Water filing dated July of 1858, in a clear, strong hand that she took to be the dead Brand patriarch's, witnessed by 2 names she did not know and notarized with a stamp she did know. The territorial seal from before statehood, which made the filing senior to any survey done since. It described the creek boundary in plain language, from the rock outcrop at the north bend to the lightning-struck oak at the south, and it described, in equally plain language, the irrigation channel running from a point 10 yards east of the rock outcrop, across both properties, with rights of use to both families in perpetuity. The second paper was a hand-drawn map of the same boundary in the same hand. The third was a copy of a letter from Caleb's grandfather, Silas Rourke, to Eleanor's husband, dated 1860, agreeing in writing that the channel and the creek were shared, and that no Rourke would dispute it. The fourth was a more recent paper, only 2 years old, folded once. It was a small printed handbill from the territorial business office in the county seat. It listed the incorporation of a new survey company. The names of the partners were listed at the bottom. The principal partner was a man Augusta had never met. The silent partner, listed in small italics below the line, in the manner of a thing the law requires you to print and hopes no one will read, was a name she had heard exactly twice in 3 weeks. Aldous Marsh, the lender in town. The peacemaker, the man Caleb had mentioned once at supper, who had carried the Rourke feed note for 2 winters and who had let the interest slide because, as he put it, we all have to get through these years. The man who Eleanor Brand had mentioned once in passing in the parlor had ridden out twice this spring to suggest gently to her that perhaps it was time to sell. Augusta sat with the papers spread on her quilt for a long time. She did not move. She did not write in her notebook. She did not say a word out loud. She folded the papers back into the tin box one by one and closed the lid, and she slid the box under the loose floorboard in the corner of her room that she had found the second day she had lived in the house. And she put her trunk over the board, and she sat down on the trunk and put her hands flat on her knees. When she came out of her room at dawn, she did not look like a woman who had not slept. She looked like a woman who had decided something. She made breakfast. She sat at the table with Caleb and Wren and ate it. She refilled Caleb's coffee and her own and Wren's milk, and at the end of breakfast, she said to Caleb, "I'd like to invite Eleanor Brand and her son Thomas to supper on Saturday. Here, and your grandfather, and the Reverend. I'd like to set a long table, and I'd like you to sit at the head of it." Caleb set his cup down very slowly. "Augusta, I know. My grandfather has not eaten under the same roof as Eleanor Brand since 1875. I know. What are you doing?" "I am setting a supper," Augusta said. "That is all I am telling you today. I will tell you the rest of it when I have all of it. I am asking you to trust me for 1 week." He looked at her over the table for a long time. Wren ate her eggs and watched the two of them. "All right," he said. That was Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, Dorsey was riding fence on the disputed strip, alone, because the Rourke south fence on the bank had broken in 2 places overnight, and the cattle had drifted, and Caleb had sent him out to walk the line and find out where. Dorsey rode out at first light in a foul humor, because Dorsey had begun, in the past week, to feel the shape of a thing changing under him, and did not yet know what the shape was. He rode along the creek with his hat pulled low, and he was a quarter-mile up from the south ford when he reined in and went very still. A man was at one of the survey stakes ahead, on foot, with a maul and a pry bar. He had not heard Dorsey because the creek was loud over the stones. He pried the stake out of the ground with 2 strong, careful pulls, walked 10 paces north, set the stake down and drove it back in with 3 blows of the maul. Then he stepped back, looked at the line of stakes he had moved this way, took a small notebook out of his coat and wrote something in it. Dorsey sat his horse behind a clump of plum brush for a long time, and watched. The man finished, put the maul and the bar in a leather case, strapped behind his saddle, on a horse Dorsey had not seen at first mounted, and rode away north along the bank without looking back. The brand on the flank of the man's horse was the brand of the livery. In town, the livery that was owned, every man in the county knew, by Aldous Marsh. Dorsey did not move for a long time after the man was gone. And then he turned his horse and rode back to the Rourke house at a walk because he needed the time, and he came into the kitchen at noon with his hat in his hands, and stood by the door and did not sit down. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. Augusta was kneading bread on the work table. She did not stop. "Mr. Dorsey, I'd take a cup of coffee, ma'am, if you've got one." She poured him a cup. He drank half of it standing by the door. She went back to her bread. After a while he said, "I owe you an apology." She kept kneading. "For the wedding day," he said. "What was said, I didn't say it, but I didn't stop it. That was my place, and I didn't do it." "All right," Augusta said. He looked at the floor. Then he said, "There's something I saw this morning on the south fence I'd like to tell Mr. Rourke. I'd like to tell you first, so you can decide whether to be in the room when I tell him." Augusta set the bread aside and wiped her hands on her apron and sat down at the table across from him, and Dorsey told her, in plain country sentences, what he had seen. Augusta listened without moving. When he was done, he said, "Will you say what you saw to a county assessor under oath?" Dorsey was quiet a long beat. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am, I will." "Good." He looked at her then. And he looked at her for the first time the way Caleb had looked at her on the church step, plainly, full in the face. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, "what is going on this ranch?" "You'll know on Saturday," Augusta said, "with everyone else. Until Saturday I'd be grateful if you'd ride fence and say nothing to anyone." "Yes, ma'am." He drank the rest of his coffee and went out, and Augusta went back to her bread. And that evening at supper Caleb looked at Dorsey across the table, and Dorsey looked at his plate and said nothing at all. And Caleb looked at Augusta, and Augusta met his eyes and gave him the smallest nod a woman can give, and Caleb did not ask. He trusted her for the week. He had said he would. He did. She wrote a letter on Thursday morning. She wrote it sitting at the kitchen table, while Wren shelled peas beside her and the bread rose on the back of the stove. She wrote it in her neat, clear hand, and she addressed it to a circuit-riding county assessor whose name she had gotten from Eleanor Brand by way of a folded note delivered Wednesday night by Thomas Brand, who had ridden across the creek in the dark for the first time in 4 years. Very quietly, for Mrs. Rourke. The letter was 4 sentences long. It cited a territorial statute by number. It said that a witnessed irregularity in a recent survey along the boundary of 2 ranches in Hollis County had come to her attention, that documents from 1858 in her possession appeared to establish a senior filing inconsistent with the new survey, and that she would be obliged if he would call upon her at his earliest convenience. She signed it Augusta Whitmore Rourke. She gave the letter to Thomas Brand when he came again Thursday evening, and Thomas Brand rode it into town and put it in the assessor's office, under the door himself. Saturday came hot and clear. By noon, Augusta had 2 hams in the oven and a great pot of beans on the back of the stove, and 3 loaves of bread cooling on the rack, and a pie of dried apples set out, and a kettle of greens. She had picked herself going slow over the coals. She had put the long table together by laying 2 of the kitchen boards across the work table, and a sawhorse Dorsey had brought in without being asked, and she had covered the whole of it with the only good cloth in the house, a tablecloth she had found folded in the linen press, white with small embroidered flowers along the edge. That had been Caleb's wife's. She had thought hard about that cloth. She had decided to use it. When she shook it out across the table, Caleb had come into the kitchen and seen it, and stopped, and Augusta had said, "Only, it's a good cloth. It's been folded for 4 years. Cloth wants to be on a table." He had not answered. He had touched the edge of it with 2 fingers. He had walked back out. Silas Rourke arrived first, in a buggy driven by a hand, in his Sunday coat. He came up the porch step on his 2 canes, and stopped in the doorway, and looked at the long table, and said, That was all he said. And he sat down where Augusta showed him at one long side, and accepted a cup of coffee, and watched the door. The Brands came at 6. Augusta saw the wagon coming up the lane from the kitchen window, and she went out onto the porch and stood there in her best blue dress, because she had decided that morning to wear it again, and she watched Thomas Brand hand his mother down from the wagon. Eleanor Brand walked up the porch, step in black bombazine and a small white collar, and she stopped at the top of the step and looked at Augusta, and Augusta looked at her, and Eleanor Brand said, "Mrs. Rourke, Eleanor? I am eating in the Rourke kitchen tonight for the first time in 22 years. Yes, Mom. I had not planned to live to do it. No, Mom." Eleanor Brand walked past her into the house. Thomas Brand followed, hat in hand, and gave Augusta a small grave nod as he passed. The Reverend came up the lane a few minutes after that on a piebald horse, in his black coat. By 6:15, Augusta had 8 people sitting at the long table in the Rourke kitchen, Caleb at the head, his grandfather to his right, Eleanor Brand directly across the table from Silas Rourke for the first time in a decade, Thomas Brand beside her, the Reverend at the foot, Dorsey at the far side near the door, Wren on a low stool at Augusta's elbow, and Augusta herself on Caleb's left, where she could see every face in the room. She served the ham, she served the beans, she served the greens and the bread and the second pot of coffee. No one spoke for the first 10 minutes except to ask for the salt. Silas Rourke and Eleanor Brand did not look at each other. They ate. They ate like 2 people who had agreed in advance not to be the first to break. Augusta let the silence sit. She had learned long ago that silence at a table is a thing you allow to do its own work. She refilled Caleb's coffee. She refilled Eleanor Brand's. She broke a piece of bread for Wren, and buttered it. After a while, Thomas Brand, looking down at his plate, said, "Mrs. Rourke, this is the best ham I have eaten in 7 years. Thank you. My mother made one like this when I was a boy." "Your mother taught me," Augusta said, although Eleanor Brand had never taught her anything, and Eleanor Brand looked up sharp and met her eyes, and then slowly, Eleanor Brand's mouth moved at the corner, the way it had moved in the parlor 4 days before. "Did she?" Eleanor Brand said. "Yes, ma'am. With sage and brown sugar at the end. She told me on Sunday." Said Silas Rourke into his beans, and it was a different MMPH than the one he had used on the porch. "My wife used sage," he said to the beans. "Did she?" Eleanor Brand said. "She did." There was another silence. It was a different silence. It was the silence of two people who have remembered, against their will, that they once knew the same dead woman, and that the dead woman would have set a table very like this one. The conversation, after that, came in pieces. The Reverend spoke of the spring grass. Thomas Brand asked Dorsey civilly about a calf they had both seen along the creek. Caleb said almost nothing, but he watched Augusta down the length of the table, and once, when she set down the coffee pot, his hand brushed her wrist as he reached for his cup, and he did not move it away at once. Silas Rourke and Eleanor Brand did not speak to each other directly. But Silas Rourke passed Eleanor Brand the bread when she asked the Reverend for it. Eleanor Brand thanked Silas Rourke when he did. Augusta heard both small things, and did not let any of it show on her face. And Wren, eating her ham slowly beside her, looked up at Augusta once, and Augusta looked down at the child, and smiled with her eyes only. And Wren went back to her plate. She had done it. She had gotten Rourke and Brand into the same room, at the same table, on the same night, for the first time in 10 years. She had done it without speaking of the creek, and without naming Marsh, and without putting the tin box on the table. She had done it on a white embroidered cloth that had been folded in a press for 4 years. She let the supper move under her hands, and she did not let her face show anything. But inside her chest something was beating that was not pride and not relief. It was the careful, watchful thing a woman feels at the highest point of a slope, when she knows that the next step is downhill, and that she will not be able to stop until the bottom. The pounding on the door came between the beans and the pie. It came hard. 3 blows. Fast, the way a man knocks when he is on a horse he has ridden hard, and does not have time for the door to be opened gently. Every head at the long table came up. The Reverend's hand went still on his fork. Eleanor Brand's hand on the head of her cane tightened. Caleb half rose. "I'll go," Augusta said, and went. "Prass?" The man on the porch was a county rider she had never seen before. He was dusty to the knees. His horse stood blowing in the lane. He had a flat sealed envelope in his hand with a red wax stamp on it she recognized from the territorial seal in the tin box. "Mrs. Rourke?" he said. "Yes." "I've a notice from the land office in Hollis Creek. Sealed delivery. For Caleb Rourke and for Eleanor Brand. They told me at the office both parties were here tonight, so I rode here." "Come in," Augusta said. He came in with his hat in his hand. He stopped at the head of the long table and looked at Caleb and at Eleanor Brand. He held the envelope out toward Caleb, because Caleb was the man at the head of the table, and the man at the head of the table was the one a rider gave a paper to. Caleb took the envelope. He broke the seal. The wax cracked once. Sharp. In the quiet kitchen, he unfolded the paper inside. He read it. His face did not change at first. Then the color went out of it in a slow, even way, from the cheekbones down to the jaw, the way the color goes out of a sky just before a hard weather. He read it again. He set the paper down on the white cloth. "Read it aloud, Caleb," Eleanor Brand said. Her voice had gone very flat. Caleb did not look up. He read. "Notice of boundary transfer," he said. "Hollis County Land Office. Purse. Under authority of survey filed this spring, the boundary between the Rourke and Brand properties along Hollis Creek is hereby redrawn at the line of the new survey stakes, effective 30 days from this date. The Brand Ranch is required to vacate the creek frontage south of the rock outcrop within that period, and to remove all stock, fence, and improvements therefrom. Co-petitioners on the original filing. He stopped. He looked at the paper. He read the rest, slowly. Aldous Marsh, lender of record, Caleb Rourke, of Rourke Ranch. Eleanor Brand stood up. She did not stand fast. She stood the way a tree stands up after a heavy snow has come off it. Her face was the color of paper. "You signed that," she said. Caleb looked up at her and across the table at his grandfather and at the Reverend, and last and longest at Augusta. "I never signed that," he said. "Who?" The rider stood in the doorway with his hat still in his hand, and the door was still open behind him, and the lamplight from the kitchen ran out across the porch boards and down into the dark of the yard. Wren had stopped eating. Her small hand was around two of Augusta's fingers under the table. Silas Rourke had set his fork down. Thomas Brand's eyes had gone to the wall above the stove and stayed there. Whack. Eleanor Brand stood at her place with one hand on the head of her cane and the other on the back of her chair, and her knuckles on both were white. Augusta looked down at the paper on the white embroidered cloth. And, suts. She looked at the red broken wax. She looked at the names at the bottom. Aldous Marsh's name printed in clean black ink, and Caleb's name printed in the same clean black ink beside it, as though the two of them had walked into the land office together and signed. She looked up at the table. She looked at each face on both sides, at Silas Rourke gone gray, at Eleanor Brand standing white-knuckled and silent, at Thomas Brand fixed on the wall, at the Reverend with his hand on his fork and his mouth slightly open, at Dorsey by the door who had risen halfway from his bench, one at Caleb at the head of the table with his hands flat on the cloth and his jaw locked, at Wren with her small hand around her fingers. She looked back down at the paper. She did not flinch. She did not speak. She felt the careful, watchful thing in her chest move from one beat to the next, and she understood with great clarity that the supper she had spent a week building had been broken on purpose at this hour, and not another, that the writer had been sent with the paper tonight because Aldous Marsh had known the supper was happening, and had wanted both families to read the notice in the same room. 30 days, Caleb's name on a paper he had not signed. The door still open behind the rider, and the night beyond it, and the creek down the slope running thin over its stones in the dark. Augusta laid her hand over Wren's small hand under the table, and she looked across the white cloth at Caleb, and she did not say a word out loud, but she let him see in her face what she had already decided, that this was not finished, and that this was where the fight began. Mere. Caleb held her look. Whatever had been locked in his jaw for the last quarter hour, eased by a single notch. Not enough for anyone else to see. Enough for her. He turned then, slow, to the rider still standing in the open doorway, with his hat in his hand and the night cold coming in around him. "You can shut the door," Caleb said. "You delivered it." The rider swallowed. "Mr. Bree, Marsh said I was to wait for a signature of receipt." "Mr. Marsh can wait, sir. Shut the door, son. Ride home. Tell him it was received." The rider hesitated a breath longer, then did as he was told. The door closed. The candle on the long table guttered once, and steadied. Eleanor Brand was still standing. Her hands were braced on the edge of the table like a woman who had felt the floor go out from under her, and had not yet decided whether to fall or to stay upright. Across from her, Caleb's grandfather, old Silas Rourke, who had spent 10 years naming the Brands every kind of thief over his evening whiskey, was looking at her with something on his face that had no name in him yet. He was not triumphant. He was an old man who had just understood that someone had been using his hatred for a tool. "Eleanor," he said. It came out rough. "Sit down." "I will not sit down in this house, under a notice that says, 'Sit down, Eleanor, you and I have been played for fools.'" She looked at him. The whole table held its breath. Then she sat slowly, the way a tree comes down when the cut has been clean. She did not look at the paper. She looked at Augusta. "You read it," she said. Augusta read it. She read it twice. The second time more slowly, her finger tracking the dates and the parcel numbers and the small notarized line at the bottom where Caleb's name had been typed in a clerk's hand and signed in a hand that was not his. She did not let her face change. Wren had not moved. Wren's small fingers were still in her own under the cloth, and she could feel the child's pulse in them like a bird kept in a pocket. "May 30 days from the 11th, Augusta said quietly. "That's the 17th of next month. It's signed by a man named J. Hollander as surveyor of record and certified by the land office on a Tuesday afternoon." "I never signed it," Caleb said again. He was not saying it to her. He was saying it to the room, in the same flat voice he had used at the church door. "I have not been near the land office since spring." "I know," Augusta said. She folded the notice once along its existing crease and laid it down on the white cloth between the bread and the lamp. Then she stood. She did not stand quickly. She stood the way she did everything, as if she had thought through standing already and was simply enacting the decision. The chair scraped a quarter-inch on the boards. Wren's hand stayed in hers for a heartbeat, and then let go. "Wah." "Eleanor," she said. "Mr. Rourke?" "Caleb. The supper is not finished. The bread is still warm, and the stew has not turned. We will sit and we will eat. The paper will be here when we are done with it, and so will I." She looked down the table at the hands. Dorsey was at the far end, his eyes on his plate, his ears red. The others were watching Caleb to see what Caleb would do. "Eat," Caleb said. They ate. It was not a supper that any of them would forget. No one said much. Eleanor took 3 bites of the stew, set down her spoon, and drank a full cup of water, like a woman who had been a long time in a desert. Silas Rourke ate without looking up. Augusta refilled cups. Wren ate her cornbread in small, careful pieces, and tucked the last piece into her apron pocket for later, the way she had done every meal since Augusta had come into the house, and Augusta let her, because there was time. When the dishes were cleared, Eleanor stood up to go. Augusta walked her to the door. On the porch, in the cold, Eleanor turned and took both of Augusta's hands in her own. Her hands were thin and very strong. "What you have in that tin box," she said low, "is the only honest paper between our families. Do you understand me?" "I understand you?" "My husband died sitting up in his chair with that box on his knees. He would not let go of it. He said one day someone would come who was not on either side. Do you understand me?" "Yes, then do not lose it, Augusta, and do not be alone in a room with Aldous Marsh." She went down the steps to her wagon. Her son helped her up. They drove off into the dark toward the creek, and Augusta stood on the porch until she could not hear the wheels any more. Behind her the kitchen window was warm with lamp. She could see Caleb at the long table with his head in his hands, and Wren standing at his elbow, not touching him, just standing there, the way a small thing stands near a tall thing when the tall thing is hurt. Augusta went back inside and put the kettle on. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the long table after Caleb had carried Wren up to bed, and she opened the tin box Eleanor had pressed into her hands 2 days before, and she laid its contents out one piece at a time on the cloth. The 1858 filing was on heavy paper. Gone, the color of weak tea. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases were soft as fabric. The dead patriarch's hand was small and slanted and careful, the hand of a man who had learned to write late and had taken pride in it. He had set down the creek boundary by metes and bounds, every chain and every link, every bearing taken off the sandstone outcrop above the north bend, and the lightning-split cottonwood at the south. He had drawn the irrigation channel in brown ink, and labeled it "shared in equal measure" for the use of both parties and their heirs in perpetuity. He had signed it. Caleb's grandfather had signed it. A territorial notary named Whitaker had stamped it. 2 witnesses, one a Methodist preacher, and one a freighter, had set their names below. It was the cleanest piece of paper Augusta had ever held. She got up and went to the corner cabinet where Silas Rourke kept his ledgers from the early years. He had grumbled about her opening them 3 weeks ago, when she had asked, and then he had handed them over because she had asked plainly, and because his hand shook now, and he could not read the small columns himself. She brought down the 1858 ledger and the 1860 and the 1872. She brought down the receipt book for fence materials and the receipt book for hired survey work. She laid them open beside the filing. She read by lamp. By the time the windows began to gray, she had what she needed. The original creek boundary as filed in 1858 ran along the eastern bank of the creek, where the cottonwood had stood, until the lightning took it in 79. The boundary the new survey had drawn ran along the western bank, putting the entire creek and 40 acres of the best brand grass on the Rourke side, while a thin spur of paper-only Rourke land was deeded over to a holding company on the Brand side to make the transfer look balanced. The irrigation channel that had been quietly filled 4 summers ago ran exactly where the original filing had said the shared channel must lie. And on the back page of the 1860 ledger, in Caleb's grandmother's hand, because the old man had never written a clean line in his life, there was a single entry, paid this day to J. Hollander, surveyor, $14, for confirmation of creek line as filed. The Hollander, who had certified the false survey last month, was the same Hollander or a son or grandson, trading on the name. Either way, the seal was the same seal. And there was one more thing. Tucked into the back of the receipt book for hired survey work was a printed circular Silas had saved, without remembering why, advertising the services of the Bluestem Survey and Title Company, with an office address on Front Street in Hollis Creek above the lender's room of Aldous Marsh. Same building. Same stairs. Augusta sat back. The light in the windows had gone from gray to pale rose. She heard Wren on the stairs above, the small, careful footfalls of a child who had learned early not to wake a house. "Come down, sweetheart," she called softly. "The fire is warm." Wren came down in her nightdress with her shoes in her hand. She climbed into the chair beside Augusta and looked at all the papers on the table without touching any of them. "Are we in trouble?" she said. It was the longest sentence the child had spoken in Augusta's hearing. Augusta looked at her. Then she reached over and took the small shoes out of Wren's lap and set them under the chair so the child could put her feet up on the rung. "No," she said. "We are not in trouble. There is a man who has been making trouble for us, and now I know how he has been doing it. Knowing how is most of the way to stopping." Wren considered this. "Is Uncle Caleb going to be all right?" "Yes." "Is Mrs. Brand going to be all right?" "Yes." "Are you going to be all right?" Augusta did not answer this at once. The question had come from a child who had watched her own parents shot dead across the creek when she was 4 years old, and who had not asked anyone such a question since. Augusta felt the careful, watchful thing in her chest move once, and then again, and she let it. "I am going to be all right, Wren," she said. "I am going to be very all right." Caleb came down a little after that. He had not slept either. She could see it in the set of his shoulders and the unshaved jaw. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the papers spread out on the long table, and at Wren in the chair, and at Augusta, with the lamp still burning at her elbow, though the windows were full of light. "You have not been to bed," he said. "I have not." "What did you find?" she told him. She told him plainly, in the order she had found it without flourish. The boundary in the 1858 filing, the false boundary in the new notice, the filled channel, exactly where the shared channel had been, the Hollander seal that had certified both, the printed circular for the Bluestem Survey and Title Company, and the address on Front Street, above Marsh's lending room. She did not tell him what to do with any of it. She set each piece in front of him in turn, and let him see. Caleb sat down. He read the 1858 filing through once, and then he read it through again. He turned the printed circular over in his fingers and held it up to the window light. The way a man holds a banknote he suspects is bad, he set it down. "He has been bleeding us against each other," Caleb said all this time, with his own hand on both ropes. "Yes, my grandfather has paid him interest for 9 years. Yes. Eleanor's husband died sitting up in a chair because he could not figure out how the water had stopped coming. Yes, he was quiet a long time." Wren had laid her cheek against Augusta's arm and was watching him with steady gray eyes. "Augusta?" "Yes. What do you need from me?" It was the first time he had asked her anything in that voice. She did not let her face change. She thought through the question the way she thought through every question, all the way to the bottom. And then she answered. "I need you to ride to the Brand house this morning with me," she said. "Not behind me, with me. Eleanor will have to see us come up the road together, or she will not be able to do what she will need to do at the hearing. I need you to sit down with your grandfather today and ask him to tell you, in his own words, every dollar he has paid Aldous Marsh since '76, and I need him to write it down for you in his own hand, because the assessor will want it that way. I need Dorsey brought to this table by this evening, because Dorsey saw something at a fence line and has been carrying it around like a stone in his boot, and I need him to set it down where I can write it out and he can sign it. And I need you to let me write a letter today to a man named Halloran, who rides assessment for the territorial office out of Junction, and to let me send it on the noon coach, and to trust me that he will come." Caleb looked at her. "How do you know about Halloran?" "I read my husband's grandfather's ledgers," she said. "And I read 3 years of the Hollis Creek paper that was stacked behind the woodbox. Halloran has been quoted twice, complaining about survey fraud in this county. He has not been listened to. He will come if he is asked properly, and the statute is named." "What statute?" "Territorial Act of 1879, Section 14, on the falsification of land office filings. It carries a fine and disbarment of the surveyor of record. I will cite it in the letter." Caleb was quiet again. Then he stood up. He looked down at the long table and at all the careful pages laid across it, and then at her, and his face did the thing it had done at the door the night before, eased one notch. "All right," he said. "We'll ride." They rode. It was a clear, cold morning, and the creek was loud over its stones, and on the Brand side, Eleanor met them on her porch with her hair pinned and her eyes sharp, and she looked at them coming up the road, side by side, and Augusta saw her shoulders come down half an inch. They sat in the parlor where the tin box had been pressed into Augusta's hands 2 days before, and Augusta laid out the same documents in the same order, and Eleanor pressed her thin, strong hand flat against the 1858 filing, as if she were testing whether it was real, and then she covered her mouth for one breath and took the hand away. "I will be at the hearing," Eleanor said. "I will stand and I will speak. I will need you, too," Augusta said. "What do you need me to say?" "You will know," Augusta said. "When the room is full and the paper is read, you will know." Eleanor looked at her a long time. Augusta Whitmore. Rourke, now. Augusta Whitmore Rourke. My husband would have liked you. Augusta did not let her face change. She inclined her head once, and Eleanor inclined hers, and that was the entire ceremony of it. They rode home along the creek, and on the way back, Caleb stopped the wagon at the bend where the lightning-split cottonwood had been and got down and walked along the bank 100 yards, and stood looking at the line of the bank as if he had never seen it before. Augusta led him. When he climbed back up to the seat, his eyes were wet, but he did not say anything about it, and she did not require him to. Dorsey came to the kitchen that evening with his hat in his hands. He stood in the doorway and would not come in until Augusta told him twice. He sat in the chair. She pointed to, he looked at the lamp and nodded her. "Ma'am," he said. "About the wedding day. That is not what I called you here for, Dorsey. That is not what I called you here for, Dorsey." "No, ma'am, but I want to say it before I say the other thing. I said what I said at the wagon, I said it loud. I meant for both sides to hear it. I am sorry for it." "What?" "I have been sorry for it since the second week, when I watched you put my supper down in front of me, and not say a word about what I had said. I had a mother who would have set a plate for me, too, no matter what I said, and I had forgot her. That is the truth of it. I am sorry." Augusta let the silence sit. It was not an unkindness. It was the room he needed to finish standing in. "Thank you, Dorsey." "Yes, ma'am. Now tell me what you saw at the fence." He told her. He had been riding the north line at first light 8 days back, the morning after. She had crossed the creek to the brand house, and he had seen a man in a brown coat at the second post south of the sandstone outcrop. The man had pulled the post up out of its hole with a pry bar and walked it 10 paces north and dug a new hole and set it. Dorsey had ridden up quietly along the wash and watched from cover. The man had not been alone. There had been another man on horseback on the rise, and Dorsey had recognized that one, Tully Mercer, who rode collections for Marsh and had broken a hand at the Brand bunkhouse 2 winters before. Mercer had said one thing to the man in the brown coat that Dorsey had heard clean across the cold air. He had said, "Mr. Marsh wants it 10 yards, no more, no less." Then the two of them had ridden off east along the wash toward town. Augusta wrote it down as he spoke, in her own hand, and read it back to him sentence by sentence, and he corrected one word, prybar, not crowbar, and then she wrote out a clean copy, and he signed it, slowly, with the careful X and name of a man who had only learned to sign late. She witnessed it. She set it on the long table beside the 1858 filing. "Dorsey, Mom, you will say this at the hearing." He swallowed. "Yes, Mom, in front of Mr. Marsh?" "Yes, Mom, you understand he will not forget you said it." Dorsey looked up from the lamp for the first time. There was something in his face she had not seen there before. A small late settling of a man into his own shape. "He never saw me to begin with, ma'am. That's what he counted on. I was furniture. He doesn't reckon furniture talks." Augusta let that lie a moment between them. "All right, Dorsey," she said. "Eat your supper." Marsh accelerated as she had known he would. The next morning a boy came up the road from town with a hand-folded note from the lender's office, calling in a side note on the Rourke feed bill, $312.4, due in 7 days, no extension available. Caleb read it once at the kitchen table and laid it down without expression, and said only, "Add it to the pile." Augusta added it to the pile. That afternoon a brand calf was found shot dead on the disputed strip, not 50 feet from the creek, a single ball through the shoulder, the carcass left where it dropped so that the buzzards would mark it from a mile off. A brand hand rode up to the Rourke gate with his rifle across his saddle and his face the color of meat, and Caleb went out to him unarmed, and stood at the gate and talked to him low for 10 minutes, and the man finally rode off without firing, which was not nothing. That evening, an hour before sundown, Aldous Marsh himself rode up the Rourke Lane on a clean bay horse. He came alone. He wore a grey suit and a clean collar, and the soft round hat of a man who wanted to look like a banker, and not like a man who hired riders. He tied his horse at the gate and walked up to the porch with his hands swinging easy at his sides, and he took the hat off before he knocked, which was the touch of a man who had practiced it. Augusta opened the door. She did not invite him in. She stepped out onto the porch and closed the door behind her, because Wren was in the kitchen, and she would not have Wren in the same air with him. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. "Mr. Marsh, I wonder if I might come in and sit with you a moment. I am happy to speak with you out here, Mr. Marsh. The air is fine." He smiled. He had a soft, slow smile, the smile of a man who had used it on widows. "It concerns the notice," he said. "I would not want any confusion to harden into trouble between neighbors. I have a thought or two about how it might be eased. For everyone. I am listening. Inside might be more. Out here, Mr. Marsh." He let the smile rest a moment longer. Then he set his hat back on his head, and put his thumbs in his vest pockets, and looked out across the yard toward the creek, as if he were admiring a view he had paid for. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, "you are a newcomer here. You have come into a difficult country, in a difficult marriage, at a difficult hour. I admire your composure. I do. There is not one woman in Hollis Creek who could have set a supper table for both these families and gotten the chairs filled, and you did it on a Tuesday night with cornbread and stew. I noticed, the whole town noticed. That is kind. I am told you have been spending time in old ledgers." "I have. I am told you have written a letter to Mr. Halloran." She did not let her face change. "I have. Mrs. Rourke." He turned his soft face on her. But the smile was still there, but the eyes had gone flat. "A woman of your particular standing in a place like this has a great deal to lose by being seen as a troublemaker. You have a roof here. You have a child you have grown fond of. You have a husband who, with the greatest respect, agreed to take a name to a paper, and not much more. There are many ways for a peace bond to come apart, and some of them leave a woman with nothing and nowhere. Numbeth, I would not want to see that happen to a woman of your size and station, for whom the road back to Kansas City would be particularly hard." She let the words rest. She did not move. She had heard versions of this sentence in 3 towns and 2 depots since she was 16 years old. He had not invented it. He had only learned where to set the knife. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "are you threatening me?" He smiled. "I am advising you. You are advising me that a woman of my size should be grateful for a roof, and not go looking for trouble, in so many words. Mr. Marsh." "One?" She took half a step toward him, not aggressive, only enough that he had to tilt his head up slightly to keep his eyes on hers, because she was the taller. "I have been looked through by better men than you my whole life. I have been called names by drunks in better towns. I have outlived a father who taught me where every chain on a fence runs, and a mother who taught me that the size of a body has nothing to do with the size of what it can carry. I am not afraid of the road back to Kansas City because I have walked it. I am not afraid of you because I have read the address on your survey company's circular, and I know what stairs it sits at the top of. You have come to my porch to tell me to be grateful. I am going to tell you to ride home. The hearing is in 4 days. You will see me there." The smile was gone. He looked at her now the way a man looks at a thing he had assumed was furniture and has just discovered is a clock, and has been counting his hours all along. "Mrs. Rourke, ride home, Mr. Marsh." He rode home. She watched him to the bend of the road, and then she went inside and shut the door and leaned her back against it for the time of one slow breath, and then she crossed the kitchen and stirred the pot. That was the Wednesday, and The hearing was Saturday noon at the land office above the feed store on Front Street, called by the assessor Holleran, who had arrived on the noon coach the day before, with a leather case and a careful expression. He had sat at the long table that evening and listened to Augusta walk him through the documents in the order she had walked Caleb through them, and he had asked 3 questions, all of them small and exact, and then he had closed the case and said, "Mrs. Rourke, you have done my work for me. I will hold the hearing, I will read the filing aloud myself. If what you have laid out is what is there, by sundown Saturday, Mr. Marsh will not have a license in this territory." Friday night, Augusta laid the documents out on the long table one more time, in the order in which they would be entered into the record. The 1858 filing in its soft creases, the new notice in its hard creases, the Blue Stem Survey and Title Company circular with its Front Street address, the incorporation papers Halloran had pulled from the territorial archive that named Aldous Marsh as silent partner holding 60% of the company under a wife's maiden name. Dorsey's signed account of the fence post, moved 10 yards north, the Rourke ledger showing payment to a J. Hollander, in 1860. The Brand ledgers Eleanor had brought over showing the irrigation channel paid for jointly and shared yearly until 1881. She laid them down. She did not arrange them prettily. She arranged them in the order a man would need to read them to understand. Caleb came in late. He had been out at the barn with the lame heifer she had nursed back through the spring, who had now started favoring the leg again with the cold coming. He sat down across from her at the long table, and looked at the papers, and he did not pick any of them up. He sat looking at the whole of them together. Wren had come down the stairs in her nightdress, and had crawled up onto the bench beside Augusta, without a word, and was leaning against her side, half asleep already. The cornbread crumbs of the day still on her collar. Augusta laid an arm around her and held her. "You have been carrying all of this," Caleb said, "since the 2nd week." "Some of it." "All of it, Augusta." She did not answer. He looked at the lamp. "I have not been much of a husband to you." "You have not been my husband at all, Caleb. We have not pretended otherwise." No, he was quiet. Then he reached across the table slow, and laid his hand palm down on top of the 1858 filing, not to touch her hand but near it, the gesture of a man who did not know yet how to ask. "After tomorrow," he said. "When tomorrow is done, whatever way it goes, I would like to sit at a table with you and talk about a thing. Not the ranch, not the paper. Another thing." Augusta looked at his hand on the filing. She looked at his face. Wren was asleep against her now, the small, even breath of a child who had decided, somewhere in the last month, that this was a safe shoulder. "All right, Caleb," she said, "after tomorrow." She carried Wren up to bed. When she came down, he had not moved. He had only put his hands over his face. She left him there and went to bed herself, and she did sleep that night, 2 clean hours before the dawn, which was more than she had asked for. The land office above the feed store on Front Street had not held 20 people in a decade. On Saturday at noon, it held 70. They had come in wagons from 40 miles. The Brands sat down the right side of the long room on the benches the assessor had ordered carried up from the church, and the Rourkes sat down the left. And for the first 10 minutes, nobody on either side spoke a word, but they were in the same room with the same air between them, and Augusta, walking up the center aisle in her best dress, with Caleb at her elbow, and Wren holding her other hand, felt the careful, watchful thing in her chest settle and steady. Eleanor Brand was already there. She had come early. She sat in the front row in black, her back straight as a fence rail, her hands folded over a small leather pouch in her lap that Augusta knew contained the receipts for 45 years of paid water assessments in her husband's hand. Silas Rourke sat across the aisle from her in a clean coat his hired girl had pressed for the first time in a year. They did not look at each other, but they did not look away, either, which was new. Aldous Marsh sat at the front table on the left, with a clerk on either side of him, and a leather folder open before him. He wore the gray suit and the clean collar. He did not look at Augusta when she came in. He looked at the assessor's empty chair. Tully Mercer was in the back against the wall, with his hat low. Halloran came in at the stroke of noon. He was a small, dry man with steel-rimmed glasses, and the bearing of a clerk who had decided once, somewhere in his late 30s, to stop being polite to liars. He sat. He arranged 3 papers. He looked up. "This is a hearing called under the Territorial Act of 1879, Section 14, concerning the certification of survey filings affecting the boundary between the Rourke and Brand holdings along Hollis Creek. I am Assessor Halloran of the Territorial Land Office, Junction Division. I will hear from the petitioner of record, Mr. Aldous Marsh of the Bluestem Survey and Title Company. I will then hear from the named co-petitioner, Mr. Caleb Rourke. I will then hear documentary evidence from any party withstanding. The boundary transfer is suspended pending this hearing. Mr. Marsh." Marsh stood. He stood smoothly. He spoke for 10 minutes in the soft, slow voice he had used on her porch. He explained that an unfortunate ambiguity in the original 1858 filing had necessitated a clarifying survey, that the Bluestem Survey and Title Company had been retained as a neutral third party at the request of both families, that the new boundary represented a fair and balanced reading of the historical record, and that the regrettable confusion around Mr. I. Rourke's signature was a clerical error easily corrected. He sat. He folded his hands. "Mr. Rourke," Halloran said. Caleb stood. He did not speak for a long moment. The room held its breath, both sides, and Augusta watched him find his voice in his own time. "I did not sign that paper," Caleb said. "I have not signed anything in Mr. Marsh's office in 2 years. I have not authorized a survey of the creek. I have not been asked. The first I saw of that notice was when a rider laid it on my supper table 11 nights ago. That is all I have to say." He sat. "Documentary evidence," Halloran said. Mrs. Rourke, Augusta stood. She did not look at Marsh. She did not look at the room. She looked at Halloran, and she walked to the front table, and she laid down the 1858 filing first. "This," she said, "is the original Land and Water filing of November the 3rd, 1858, witnessed by the Reverend Mr. By Hosea Coyle and the freighter Daniel McTavish, notarized by Territorial Notary Whitaker and signed by Aaron Brand and Silas Rourke. It sets the creek boundary, along the eastern bank, at the lightning-split cottonwood, which stood until the fire of '79 and whose stump remains visible at the south bend. It sets the irrigation channel as shared in equal measure for the use of both families and their heirs in perpetuity. I would ask the assessor to read it aloud." Halloran read it aloud. He read it slowly. He read every chain and every link. He read the names of the witnesses. He read the words shared in equal measure for the use of both parties and their heirs in perpetuity. And at those words Eleanor Brand closed her eyes for one breath and opened them again. "Next document, Mrs. Rourke. The notice delivered to my husband on the 11th of last month. It sets the boundary along the western bank and transfers the entire creek and 40 acres of Brand grass to Rourke Title, with a paper spur of unirrigated land transferred to a holding company on the Brand side. It is signed Caleb Rourke in a hand that is not my husband's. It is certified by J. Hollander, surveyor of record, on behalf of the Bluestem Survey and Title Company. Next, a printed circular of the Bluestem Survey and Title Company, listing its office as 22 Front Street, Hollis Creek, 2nd floor. Next, The incorporation papers of the Blue Stem Survey and Title Company, filed with the Territorial Office of Incorporations in 1882, naming as silent partner, holding 60% of company shares, one Mrs. Lavinia Marsh, formerly Lavinia Hollander of 22 Front Street, Hollis Creek. Mrs. Lavinia Marsh is the wife of the petitioner, Mr. Aldous Marsh, and J. Hollander, surveyor of record, is her brother. The office of the Blue Stem Survey and Title Company shares a building, a stairway, and a back door with the lending office of Mr. Aldous Marsh. The room did not exactly make a sound. It made a kind of inward breath on both sides of the aisle at once. Marsh did not move. His face had not changed, but his clerks, one on each side of him, had gone very still. Next, Mrs. Rourke, sworn account of Mr. Blank, Dorsey Vane, hand of the Rourke Ranch, regarding the relocation of fence post number 2, south of the sandstone outcrop, on the morning of the 4th of last month, in his own hand, and witnessed by me. Mr. Vane is in attendance and will testify. Mr. Vane. Dorsey stood. His ears were red, and his hands shook on the brim of his hat. He spoke clearly. He told what he had seen. Wah! He named Tully Mercer by name, and at the name Mercer pushed off the back wall and started toward the door. And Halloran, without raising his voice, said, "The bailiff will close the door," and the man at the door closed it, and Mercer stopped. Dorsey told the rest. He told the words Mercer had said across the cold air. He told them twice, because Halloran asked him to. He sat. Next. Mrs. Rourke. Receipts of the Brand family for 45 years of paid water assessments on the shared channel, brought today by Mrs. Eleanor Brand. Receipt book of the Rourke family showing payment in 1860 to a J. Hollander for confirmation of the creek line as originally filed in the hand of Mrs. Mary Rourke. Ledger entries from both families showing the joint maintenance of the irrigation channel from 1858 until the summer of 1881, at which point the maintenance entries cease in both ledgers in the same month, and the channel itself was filled in. I have walked the channel. I have stood in the depression where it lay. I have shown it to the assessor this morning. Halloran nodded once. I have walked it with her, he said to the room. It is where she says it is. He looked down at the documents. He looked up. He did not look at Marsh. On the evidence presented, the boundary transfer of the 11th of last month is voided. The certification of J. Hollander as neutral surveyor of record is withdrawn. The Blue Stem Survey and Title Company is suspended from operation in this territory, pending a full review of every filing it has certified in the last 6 years. Mr. Aldous Marsh is referred to the territorial prosecutor on charges of fraud, false certification, and conflict of interest under Section 14. The creek boundary stands as filed in 1858. The shared channel will be reopened at joint expense. Is there any party withstanding who wishes to address the court before I close? Eleanor Brand stood. She stood the way she had sat, straight as a fence rail, the small leather pouch still in one hand. She did not look at Marsh. She did not look at Halloran. She looked at Augusta, and then she looked across the aisle at Silas Rourke. And then she turned and looked at the whole packed room of both families on both sides of the aisle. "Poe, my husband," she said, "spent the last 4 years of his life trying to figure out why the water had stopped coming, and the calves had started disappearing, and a man across the creek he had once called by his first name had started to be a stranger. He died in a chair without an answer. I have hated the name Rourke for 10 years. I taught my sons to hate it. I sat across a supper table from Silas Rourke, 11 nights ago, for the first time in a decade, and could not look him in the eye. I have been a fool. I have been a fool. Because a man in a clean collar told me where to put my hate, and I put it where he told me. I want it said in this room and written down. She turned then to Augusta. "Augusta Whitmore Rourke," she said. Her voice did not shake. "You crossed the creek with a basket. You sat in my parlor and you let me hand you a tin box without making me explain. You did not flinch at anything I said, and you did not flinch at anything anyone has said to you. Since you stepped down from a wagon in this county, you are the first honest soul to cross that creek in 10 years. I am old enough to know what an honest soul looks like when one walks into the room. And I will tell this room and every room after it for as long as I have voice. You are the first, you are the first." She sat. The room did not move. Halloran cleared his throat once. "This hearing is closed." It was not over in a single afternoon. Of course, the way Halloran had said it would be. It was over enough. By sundown Saturday, Aldous Marsh had been escorted to his office by Halloran's bailiff, and his ledgers had been sealed. By Monday morning, the Blue Stem Survey and Title Company had a paper nailed to its door. By the end of the week, 3 other ranchers in the county had come forward with notices of their own to be examined. By the end of the month, Marsh's lending office had been closed by the territorial prosecutor, and his house had been mortgaged out from under him by the very note holders he had once squeezed. He was not jailed. The prosecutor settled for a fine and disbarment and a quiet agreement that he would leave the county. Tully Mercer left the county on his own a day after the hearing. Nobody saw him go. The Saturday of the hearing, when the room had emptied, and the benches had been carried back to the church, and the documents had been signed into the record under Halloran's seal, Caleb and Augusta walked down the stairs of the land office onto Front Street with Wren between them. The town was out. People who had not spoken to her since the wedding day spoke to her now. A woman she had never met pressed a jar of preserves into her hands. A brand boy of about 16, who had been raised to spit when O'Rourke rode past, took off his hat to her. Augusta took it all without flinching and without smiling too widely. She had not earned this in an afternoon. She had earned it in 3 months of doing small, honest things in front of people who had not been looking, and now they were looking. And that was a different thing she would have to learn how to bear. They drove home along the creek. The sun was low, the water ran clean and loud over the stones. Halfway home, at the bend where the lightning-split cottonwood stump was still visible at the south curve, Caleb pulled the wagon up and set the brake, and sat looking at the water for a long time without speaking. Wren had fallen asleep on the seat between them, with her cheek against Augusta's arm. "Augusta," he said. "Yes, I have a thing to say to you, and I would like to say it now, before we get back to the house, and there are people on the porch." "All right, Caleb." He looked at the water and not at her, which she allowed him, because she understood by now that this was how he said the difficult things. "My grandfather told me to marry you," he said. "He told me a name had come in from Kansas City, and that the woman had no kin, and that she would do for a peace bond. I told him I did not want a wife. He told me he did not care what I wanted. I went to the church because he told me to. I stood at the door because he told me to. I rode home with you in the wagon, and I told you on the road that I expected nothing from you but a name on a paper, and I meant it. I did not look at you. I did not look at you for 3 weeks. I did not look at you because I had buried a wife in '83, and I had decided I would not look at another woman in my house ever again. I made that decision sitting outside her kitchen door at night, which is where you caught me one of those weeks, and where I caught you seeing me." He stopped. He swallowed. "I am telling you this because I want it said out loud. I did not marry you to end a feud. I married you because my grandfather told me to. That is the whole truth of how it started. I owe you the whole truth of how it started before I say the next part." "All right, Caleb." "The next part," he said, "is that I would marry you now." He looked at her. "I would marry you now because I have spent 3 months watching you do. In my house and on my land, and at my supper table, and at a hearing this afternoon, what 9 men of this county could not have done in 9 years. I would marry you now because I have watched my niece, who did not speak a sentence for 2 years, ask you a question in a kitchen at sunup and lean her cheek on your arm in a wagon at sundown. I would marry you now because I have watched Eleanor Brand stand up in a room full of people and call you the first honest soul to cross the creek in a decade, and I have known for weeks, Augusta, that she is right. I would marry you now because for 3 months I have been a man who had agreed to a name on a paper. And I am asking you to be my wife instead. I am asking you plainly because you do not deserve to be asked any other way. He stopped. I am not most men, Augusta. I think you know that by now, but I would like to hear what you say. Augusta did not let her face change all the way through. She let the careful, watchful thing in her chest move once. She looked at the water and at the stump of the cottonwood, and at the small, sleeping child between them. And then she looked at him, and she said what she had decided, before she had spoken to him, that she would say if he asked Caleb. Yes, I will be your wife. Not the wife of a peace bond, the wife of a man. I will be that on 3 conditions, and I will name them now, because I will not have them assumed. Name them. The creek stays shared. The 1858 filing stands. We will reopen the channel together this spring at joint expense with the Brand family, and we will keep it shared in our time and in our heirs' time, as the filing requires. That is the first done. Wren becomes ours in name. We adopt her formally before the circuit judge the next time he rides through. She is not a niece in our house. She is our daughter. She has been our daughter since the 2nd week, and she will have the paper that says so. Says, that is the 2nd. Done, Augusta. I would have asked for that one if you had not. I know you would. That is why I asked first, the 3rd. Yes. My name goes on every deed beside yours. Every parcel of Rourke land that has my husband's name on a deed will have my name on the deed. Beside his, by the end of the month. I am not a woman who is going to live on land that does not have her name on it. I have lived that way too long. That is the 3rd done. She turned her face toward the creek, so he would not see her eyes go. For the half-second they went, she did not let him see. She let one breath come, and one breath go, and then she turned back. Then yes, Caleb Rourke, she said, I will be your wife. He took her hand. He took it the way he did everything, slow and exact, with the calloused thumb resting once across her knuckles. He did not kiss her. He did not lean across the sleeping child between them to do anything dramatic. He held her hand on the wagon seat in the late light, and after a moment, she lifted her other hand and laid it for a breath against the side of his face, against the unshaved jaw, because she had been wanting to do that for a month and had not let herself. He closed his eyes against her palm for the time of one breath, and then she took her hand down and he picked up the reins. They drove home. Months later, on a clear evening in the long blue of an autumn dusk, Augusta stood on the porch of the Rourke house, between Caleb on her left and Wren on her right, and watched the cattle drink at the creek. The Brand herd was on the eastern bank, where the 1858 filing said they belonged, and the Rourke herd was on the western bank, where the 1858 filing said they belonged, and the channel between, dug clean again that spring by hands from both ranches working side by side, ran full and bright in the low light. A Brand hand on a roan and a Rourke hand on a bay were sitting their horses together on the south rise, talking about something Augusta could not hear, and from the way they were sitting, it was not work. Wren had her hand in Augusta's. She was 8 years old now. She was tall for her age and quiet still, but it was a different quiet, the quiet of a child who had decided what she was going to say before she said it, which was Augusta's own quiet, and Augusta did not mind that she had given it to her. Caleb's hand was on the small of her back, light, the touch of a man who had finally learned where his hand belonged. On the deeds in the strong-box, in the cabinet, in the parlor, in the clerk's hand of the circuit office, Augusta's name stood beside his on every parcel of the Rourke holding. On the adoption paper folded inside the family Bible, Wren Rourke was their daughter in the eyes of the territory and of the God old Reverend Coyle had sworn the original filing under in 1858. On the wall of the kitchen, where the door to Caleb's dead wife's pantry had been sealed for 2 years, the door now stood open, and the pantry behind it was full of Augusta's preserves, in clean jars, in straight rows. She had not gotten smaller. She had not been asked to. She had been asked to take her seat at a table and to keep it, and she had kept it, and the table had grown around her until it sat both families and a child, and a wing of light from a kitchen window at sundown. She thought, standing there with the cattle at the water and her husband's hand at her back and her daughter's hand in her own, of the rider at the open door 8 months ago, and the careful, watchful thing in her chest that had moved from one beat to the next. She thought of Eleanor Brand standing up in a room and calling her the first. She thought of Dorsey on the bench at the hearing, with his ears red and his voice steady. She thought of the man in the gray suit, who had stood on this very porch and told her, smiling, that a woman of her size should be grateful for a roof. She had not been invisible. She had never been invisible. She had only been unseen by men who had not yet learned to look. The looking was not her work. The being was a horse came up the lane at dusk. Augusta saw him before Caleb did. He came slowly, in a coat that was not his good coat. The bay horse had been sold. This was a sorrel borrowed from somebody, and the man on it was thinner than he had been in the spring, and his collar was not clean. Caleb's hand went still on her back. "Augusta," he said low, "I see him. You do not have to. I know I do not have to." She watched Marsh come up the lane. He stopped at the gate. He did not dismount at first. He sat on the borrowed horse and looked up at the porch, where the three of them stood, and he took off his hat. It was an old hat. It had a sweat ring at the band. He spoke from the gate. "Mrs. Rourke, Mr. Marsh, I am leaving the county tomorrow. I have come to say so. I would not have stopped, but the road runs past your gate, and I did not want it said later that I had passed without stopping." "Get down off the horse, Mr. Marsh," she said. "Come up. There is a plate at the table." He looked at her. "Mrs. Rourke, there is a plate at the table, Mr. Marsh. Get down off the horse." He got down. He came up the steps slowly, an older man than he had been on her porch in spring. Caleb did not move. Wren did not move. Augusta opened the door, and Marsh came into the kitchen with his hat in his hand. And Augusta set a clean plate at the foot of the long table, far from the head where Caleb sat, and she ladled stew into the plate and laid out cornbread beside it, and set a cup of water at the right hand and pulled the chair out for him. He sat very carefully, as if the chair might not hold him. He ate. He ate slowly. Wren came and stood beside Augusta at the stove, and watched him without expression, and Augusta laid her hand on Wren's small shoulder, and held her there, because she would not have the child afraid in her own kitchen, and she would not have the child cruel, either, and the staying was the lesson. Marsh did not speak. He ate the stew, and he ate the cornbread, and he drank the water. When he was finished, he laid his fork down across the plate, and he sat looking at the table for a long time. "Mrs. Rourke," he said finally, without lifting his head, "I do not know why you did this. You were hungry, Mr. Marsh. I do not know why. It is not for you to know, Mr. Marsh. Get up now. Get on your horse. Ride out of the county. Do not come back. He stood. He set the hat on his head. At the door, he stopped and turned, and looked at her once more, and he opened his mouth to say something, and then closed it, because there was nothing to say that the meal had not already said for him. He went out. He went down the steps. He got on the borrowed horse at the gate, and he rode off west into the last of the light. And Augusta stood in the doorway with her hand on Wren's shoulder and watched him to the bend of the road and past it. And then she closed the door. Caleb had not moved from his seat at the head of the table. "Augusta," he said. "Yes, you did not have to do that either." "I know." He looked at her. He smiled, a small smile, the smile of a man who had finally learned the shape of his own wife. "You are not most women," he said. She let the small smile come on her own mouth, for the first time that day. "No, Caleb," she said. "I am not." She went and sat down at the table beside him. Wren climbed onto the bench at her other side and laid her cheek against her arm. Outside the window, the light went from blue to gray to the first deep dark, and somewhere down the slope, the creek ran clean over its stones, on the boundary it had been given in 1858, between two ranches that would water their cattle from it together for as long as the heirs of Aaron Brand and Silas Rourke walked the ground. She had earned every acre of it. She had earned it in cornbread and in stew, and in ledgers read by lamp, and in a hand laid over a small hand under a white cloth on a night when a rider had been sent to break a supper. She had earned it without getting smaller and without getting quieter, and without taking up 1 inch less of any room she had walked into. She had never been invisible. She had only for a little while been in a country that had not yet learned how to look at her. The country had learned